But it takes a while for people to understand, because we think our currency is stable, we use it every day, that therefore it is stable and everything else is unstable. And one of the pernicious things that comes out of inflation, which is always caused by government, is that government and the politicians look for scapegoats. We point out in the book that in Roman times, they blamed Christians. That was great for the lions, but it did not cure the inflation, which helped destroy the Roman Empire. In medieval times, they blamed witches. In the 20s in Germany, they blamed Jewish merchants and bankers. Richard Nixon blamed greedy oil producers in the Middle East and elsewhere. And today they're blaming everyone but themselves.
Hello, my name is Anne McElhenney.
And I'm Phelim McAleer.
Welcome to the Anne and Phelim Scoop in Thanksgiving week, right, Phelim?
Well, that's a big debate. Do Americans have Thanksgiving or do they have Thanksgiving week? I don't think they have Thanksgiving week. They have the Thanksgiving period, or do they just have Thanksgiving? And is the Thanksgiving period, is that a European invention? Is it a way Ireland now has a St. Patrick's Day festival?
Yeah. Everything gets extended. But anyway, you're basically, this show is coming out the day before Thanksgiving. People probably will be watching over the weekend.
Yes.
And it's made us obviously, and I think it's a great idea, by the way. Thanksgiving is a marvellous idea to get everyone to take a minute out of their crazy lives to remember and thank the people that matter to them and that are important to them. And you are very important to us. We're just two. The joke that we say, by the way, when we make speeches is that we're just a couple of immigrants doing a job Americans just won't do. And in some way, we came to this country and had these ideas of telling these stories that weren't getting reported, and found all these donors who are so generous and kind
correct.
And allow us to do these things. I mean, look at what happened this year. So we're very thankful for you, and particularly this year. Look at what we've achieved together this year. So we had our play in New York, O Gosnell, a play about the truth, which we made at the very last minute in response to a comedy about abortion that was being huge amounts of money being spent, big Hollywood money being spent on a comedy about abortion.
Yes.
So we thought, let's actually have a play on at the very same
time
telling the truth about abortion. And we did that, because of you. We also had our true crime podcast.
And just want to say that O Gosnell, the story about the truth, was mentioned twice in the New York Times, forced the New York Times to cover it twice. And other mainstream media, it was a huge success.
Yeah, so very, very grateful. And then we decided, in this podcast world, a lot of the ecosystem of the podcast world is a lot of people talking like we are, but there's a whole other part of the podcast world, and particularly true crime is huge. And we thought, we had done all these interviews with Detective Jim Wood, with Christine Wexler. We had interviewed Gosnell in prison.
Mm-hmm.
We had so much audio. We had all these audio tapes that we'd had for just lots of them from back in the day when we started doing the movie and then we decided, let's do a true crime podcast, and we called it Serial Killer, a true crime podcast. It went to number 10 worldwide of true crime podcasts, which meant a huge new audience of people found out about Gosnell, and by finding out about Gosnell, found out the truth about abortion. And again, it happened because of you. And we're super, super grateful to you for that. And we're very, very proud, by the way, of that podcast. And if you haven't listened to it, please go to your phone, find the podcast app, put in Serial Killer, a true crime podcast. And the thing we really want you to do is share it, particularly with young people. Young people listen to these true crime podcasts, and ours sounds exactly like all the rest. And by the way, if there ever was a true crime story that needs telling and retelling, it's the Gosnell story. And also this year, if that wasn't enough, we obviously brought out the My Son Hunter movie, which was huge and has been obviously the massive work of our the last couple of years. The response has been extraordinary from conservatives, obviously loving the film, but the left melting down. But in their meltdown, being forced to write over and over and over again about the movie in Rolling Stone, in the Washington Post, in Vox. Go on, Philip, like everywhere, everyone has written about it, like huge streets. The Guardian wrote, I think The Guardian wrote 2,000 words and hadn't watched it.
The Daily Kos wrote 3,000 words and hadn't watched it. I mean, it was we just put up some of the headlines there.
And
Newsweek wrote about it 5 times.
And our whole point about making, one of the big reasons for making this movie was to force people who did not want to recognize the laptop, did not want to know this story,
Yes.
to force them into talking about it.
And talking of which,
talking of which, yes,
CBS just earlier this week, CBS have finally studied the laptop, got an independent forensic auditor, and they've come to the conclusion, acknowledged that the laptop is real and the contents of it are real. Now, does that mean they're going to launch an investigation into who's the big guy? Where's the 10% gone? Where's the money gone? Was that videotape, or was the message of Joe Biden congratulating Hunter and talking about business? Are they real? Of course they're real. They say that it's real. So they've now acknowledged the laptop is real. I think our movie really forced their hand on that. And now are they going to start looking into the contents, this treasure trove of what really happens behind the scenes?
But it's forced. I mean, what we achieved was exactly what we set out to do, and we did it because of you, because of your help. We got the left to talk about the laptop, and they have talked a lot about the laptop, including, you mentioned films, some of these, very, very lefty podcast reviewers who have spent hours and hours examining the movie and writing about the movie. But the one thing that they've always had to acknowledge, of course, they say the movie is terrible, it's awful, they're so upset that we ever made it. I love that headline. What was that fabulous headline, Philip? From, who was it? From was not the Atlantic.
New Yorker, 2,000 words. In the prestigious New Yorker.
And what was the headline?
The My Son Hunter movie is not the movie
it's not the Hunter Biden movie
we want. Or we'd need. And it's like, well, it's the only one you've got, and it's the only one you're going to get because no one else is going to do it. So, stop pretending like there's all these Hunter Biden movies in the pipeline. There's not. So this is it. So let's work with what we've got. The money you sent in allowed us to hire Robert Davi, hire Brian Godawa to write it. They brought so much to it.
Lawrence Fox. We had Gina Carano,
John James, a crew in Serbia, and the crew here in the United States.
The composer.
It takes a lot of professional people to make a movie this good.
Actually, one of you, thank you very, very much, has donated a $50,000 matching donation. So we will get the $50,000 if we get another $50,000, and that campaign is ongoing right now. So if you haven't given before, please think about giving now. All you've got to do is go to unreportedstorysociety.com. unreportedstorysociety.com and give what you can. As I said, whatever you give will be doubled.
And if we don't match the 50,000, we don't get
the 50,000.
So please we don't want to waste that opportunity.
It's rather urgent, and we need that.
The movie. By the way, you can see the movie at mysonhunter.com.
Yes, and by the way, and you can still. And by the way, that's still an idea for Christmas. By the way, to get someone a present of the My Son Hunter movie, which is now available on DVD as well.
You can also buy a gift subscription to view the movie. You can send it to someone else's email address. So maybe over Thanksgiving as a gift, you can send someone the My Son Hunter movie. The people you love and the people you don't love might appreciate it, and the people who don't love you might appreciate it. So what else is on the rest of the show, Dan?
And so today we also asked the question that people really want to know, particularly coming up to Thanksgiving: what is inflation and what can we do about it? And who else to answer that question other than the very great Steve Forbes?
She said, he said, and nobody watched. Disney, one of the worst movies, a woke movie has been one of the worst movies in the history of Hollywood.
The worst openings.
Worst openings. And Disney feels the chill wind of wokeism and why Donald Trump may be hardest hit. We unpack the latest Hollywood happenings. And this is really, 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 really important. Why you should never, never, ever give money to any charity that has a quote unquote orphanage in the developing world. We have an interview that will make you think twice about everything you've ever heard about orphanages.
And the BBC just make a very shocking discovery. I mean, it's just anyway, we'll bring you that. And also, environmentalists really have all the worst ideas. We'll tell you about their latest appalling idea. But we're going to start today
with Steve Forbes, who needs no introduction, but we're in the interview. We're going to give him a lengthy introduction.
Yes.
He's got a new book out called Inflation: Why It's Bad, What Is It, Why It's Bad, and How to Fix It. Let's go over to the interview we did just before we came on air. Let's go over to that interview now. So, how to introduce Steve Forbes? He's so accomplished. He's the author and co-author of several books, including Money, the best-selling book Capitalism: How It'll Save Us, which is a very important book. The Flat Tax Revolution, which I think whose time is coming, I think. And he helped create the award-winning documentary In Money We Trust. You may also remember in 1996 and 2000, he was campaigned for the Republican nomination for the presidency. We'd have a very different country now if that had been successful.
Yes.
He's probably best known as the chairman and editor-in-chief of Forbes Media, which produces Forbes magazine and is one of the foremost names in business information. He's a widely respected economic prognosticator, has won multiple awards for predictions, which is saying a lot.
So good idea that we have him on
Yes,
here now.
he also hosts a webcast, What's Ahead. We have him on to discuss his latest book, which couldn't be more timely. The book is called Inflation. What is it? Why it's bad? And how to fix it. And he's co-written it with Nathan Lewis and Elizabeth Amos. So, welcome, Steve Forbes. Welcome to the Ann and Phelim Scoop.
Good to be with you. Thank you.
The book couldn't be more timely. Inflation is on everyone's lips, despite what some people on The View might have said. But let's tackle the first part of your book. The first part of the title of your book, Inflation. What is it? And let me just tell you what inflation is, Mr. Forbes. Inflation, it's obviously high prices caused by the pandemic/Ukraine war, which induced supply chain and energy shocks. It'll be tough but temporary, won't it, Mr. Forbes?
Well, that's right. And you hit on something very important. There are two kinds of inflation price rises. One is from events like a war or the shutdowns, which disrupt production, disrupt transportation, and lead to higher prices.
Mm-hmm.
Those non-monetary kinds of inflation, usually will cure themselves if governments let them, if they just get out of the way. After World War II, the U.S. made a transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy, removed price controls, removed rationing and the like. For a couple of years, prices rose, shortages were there. You don't go from making a tank to a refrigerator overnight, that kind of a conversion. But eventually it gets done and things return to more of a normal pace. Yeah. Unfortunately, today, of course, governments are still disrupting things. China's still going for its insane shutdown, lockdown policies, which is disrupting supply chains yet again. Our own government, as you know, is waging war against oil and gas,
That's right.
as well as piling on regulations, hurting small businesses and the like.
Yes.
But the U.S. economy is very resilient and is finding ways to overcome those supply chain problems.
Yes.
The traditional kind of inflation, the really destructive kind, is when you have a devaluation of your currency.
Exactly.
It becomes less valuable, usually because the government creates too much of it. And so the Federal Reserve and our Treasury Department has been guilty of that. Even before the pandemic, the dollar was declining in value. And this gets to something also very important today, is first, you don't cure supply chain problems by depressing an economy and raising interest rates. And in terms of monetary inflation, you don't do it by making people poorer. Britain, as you know, has just put in a massive slew of new taxes to crush the people there. Our government, the Federal Reserve, believes you fight inflation by making people poorer. But what you do, the way you fight inflation is very simple. Simply make the currency, in this case the dollar, stable in value. And the rest will take care of itself.
Yes.
It's like giving an antibiotic. Just give the antibiotic, and the body will cure itself.
Yeah, I was being slightly sarcastic at the beginning because I suppose even to leftists like to portray business people as evil, capitalist, rapacious, money grabbing. But if they are, they will get over the supply chain issues. I mean, we've done a lot of work in the oil and gas on the oil and gas industry, fracking and that. And I do remember this thing that the oil and gas guys used to say: the cure for low prices is low prices. The cure for high prices is high prices. In the oil and gas industry. Sorry, they'll keep producing, and there'll be a glut in the market.
And one of the things to remember about the whole thing on free enterprise is people are always finding ways to do more things more efficiently, more productively. You mentioned fracking. Fracking's been around about 20 years. It was a miracle, not of the big oil companies, but of a small gas company headed by a fellow named George Mitchell. Nearly went bust trying to develop it, finally came up with the formula and technology. And in the last 20 years, we've gotten more new energy from fracking 800% more energy, new energy from fracking than from renewables at a fraction of the cost. Hello?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, yeah. We actually talked about George Mitchell recently. I don't know why they don't have a statue up to him. I mean, most people in America probably don't even know his name. And this is the guy that, that revolutionized energy forever, except for most places like Europe and Ireland, who've decided not to frack at all. Despite the fact
Or
that
New York State.
Yes.
Exactly, and parts of everywhere,
Yes.
and California.
Yes. So, I was also very interested in what you said about rising prices. That you said there's symptoms, not the cause of the problem. Most people think inflation, the cause of inflation is rising prices. No, you're saying that's a symptom of the problem. So tell me how that's not true, and tell me what the problem is if this is a symptom.
Well, what it means is that when you lower the value of a currency, it ends up buying less. And this is where it's like a virus in a computer. It corrupts the information. Prices are essential for an economy. We do it to billions of transactions each day all around the world. And you trust prices are giving you an accurate information about what people want and what people don't want. And a classic example of the virus is back in the 70s when we had a great inflation and oil went from $3 a barrel to almost $40 a barrel. And people thought the price is going up, therefore we must be running out of this stuff. And so you had a lot of investment in it. Then in the early 80s, inflation was conquered. Oil crashed from $40 down to $10 a barrel, finally stabilized at $20 to $25 a barrel.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't so much oil became more dear or less plentiful, but the dollar was weakened. And we did the same thing in the early 2000s. Weakened the dollar. Oil went from $25 over $100 a barrel.
Right.
Copper went up. Wheat went up. Soybeans went up. Everything went up. And people thought, oh, we must be having shortages again. No, it was a weak currency. And so the prices don't reflect so much supply and demand as the fact that you've got a troubled currency. But it takes a while for people to understand because we think our currency is stable. We use it every day. That therefore it is stable and everything else is unstable. And one of the pernicious things that comes out of inflation, which is always caused by government, is that government and the politicians look for scapegoats. We point out in the book that in Roman times, they blamed Christians. That was great for the lions, but it did not cure the inflation, which helped destroy the Roman Empire. In medieval times, they blamed witches. In the 20s in Germany, they blamed Jewish merchants and bankers. Richard Nixon blamed greedy oil producers in the Middle East and elsewhere. And today they're blaming everyone but themselves.
They create the problem, and then their answer to the problem is more what created the problem.
What strikes me while just listening to this conversation is, isn't it an awful shame that children aren't forced to study economics in school? I remember a friend of mine who is a doctor and who somehow had to, at one point in her career, had to do some, economic medicine or whatever, learn about the economies of medicine, and said everyone should. And her takeout, which was brilliant, was people have no idea where money comes from, how money is made, how the economy works. And that puts them in a very bad position when they're actually voting for people. I mean, is that a big problem as well? People have no idea how any of this works.
Well, that's right. And I think we should do more. When I was a kid, back when dinosaurs were roaming the earth, they took us little kiddies to a dairy to see how milk was actually made. It just doesn't show up on the shelf or in a carton at school. The cows have to be milked.
Yes.
Milk has to be pasteurized and bottled. It has to be delivered. All the things that go into something as simple as seemingly as milk. Get an appreciation. These things just don't happen. Somebody has to make them happen.
Yes.
And that's why we have today, we just take it for granted. I mean, handhelds are a miracle. If you'd said 30 years ago, Grandma could operate a supercomputer, why, you would be given some strange looks.
Yes.
And now today, thanks to high tech, everyone has a supercomputer in their hand. They don't have to even know anything about science or engineering or software to be able to operate the thing. And we so take it for granted.
Yeah.
So if you place a conference call to Outer Mongolia, and it takes more than 6 seconds to connect, we say, what a piece of crap this device is. And so we take these miracles for granted.
Yeah.
But in a free society, It's free people doing things, big things, small things every day.
Yeah.
And that's why when you corrupt the money, you create conditions that make that less and less likely to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And it turns people on themselves. We talked about scapegoating. So people turn on each other. They don't Keynes was right about one thing, that not one in a million understands what is happening, undermining the laws of economics.
Yeah.
Yes.
That lead people to lead to some ugly situations,
Yes.
as we've seen in history time and
Yeah.
time again. And what's so amazing is that after 3,000, 4,000 years of this, they still make the same bloody
Yes.
mistakes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And the
Yeah.
schools don't teach
Yeah,
what-
but school,
why,
yeah, but
why,
school,
why that happens.
yeah, and while they're not teaching that, you know, we obviously know that they're teaching an awful lot of other complete crap. And we make the point, you know, we made a documentary about fracking, and one of the points, and it really struck me, and it, you know, because I was thinking about my own knowledge about power and energy, was how many people, I mean, you know, been an interesting question, how many people in America, you know, when they stand under their lovely power shower, how many of them have any idea what the energy mix was to create that? And if they knew it, by
That
the way,
miracle, by the
that
way.
miracle, right,
Of a power shower.
of turning of power shower or turning lights on, if they had any idea of the mix involved in that, it might make them a lot more clever when they go to vote about, you know, for example, you know, we're just talking today actually about the fact that every hydroelectric plant in the whole of California are going to be shut down at a cost of $500 million. I mean, it's not an extraordinary
Because of dams.
because
The
of
dams
you know,
are now
dams are evil, obviously, you know.
Yeah.
And people realize that 20% of all the electricity in California was made by hydro. Maybe they might think differently about that decision.
Well, and also visit either an oil field or an offshore platform
Yeah.
and see how sophisticated,
Amazing.
and again, miraculous when you think about it, being able to sink something that complex in the sea and have it operate with such precision. I mean, it's the kind of stuff that would be science fiction 100 years ago.
Never mind the deep sea. Go to a fracking plant in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
I mean, they have to go thousands of feet precision and then explode open rock so that oil and gas comes out of it. I mean, that's like surgery on a, you know, microsurgery. And you walk into a fracking plant, into those vehicles, there's more banks of computers than you'd see in a Hollywood studio.
No, but children. But it's like, but when you talk about that miracle, I mean, the miracle, and you mentioned George Mitchell. I mean, what an extraordinary man! What an incredible thing that he discovered, and invented. You know, the idea that they have those frac sites, which are tiny, you know, have a very tiny, you know, footprint or whatever they call it, and that they do this frac job for, like, I remember asking a bunch of high school students at Young America's Foundation the other day. I asked them the question, you know, like, how long do you know, when they do that frac job, how long do you think it takes them to do the frac job? And of course, none of them knew that. And I said, you know, it's about 2 or 3 days at the very most. And I said, how long do you think the gas comes up afterwards? And they were like, you know, a month, you know. And I was going, yeah, 10, 20, maybe 30 years. Yeah. I mean, people have no idea. This information is not getting communicated. And it's kind of like what you're doing with this book, you know, communicating this incredibly, you know, you see, to ordinary people, it's very complicated because all they see is that the prices are rising and they can't work out why it's happening. And they're not making the connection also, I think, which is a really important connection between those rising prices and the people who are occupying the White House and are in power and making all the decisions.
Okay, can we get back to the book?
Yes.
We need to get back to the book.
I was doing that right. I was doing that segue right there.
Doing that segue. So what about the people who say, oh, inflation's temporary? By the way, not that fracking and energy is a very interesting subject.
Yes.
We've made documentaries on it, but
we're a little bit obsessed with it.
Mr. Forbes is here, and let's talk to him.
I think Mr. Forbes has a big interest, by the way. I mean, himself. He first mentioned fracking. That's what got us going here, Phil.
Okay. But what about inflation? What about people who say inflation is going to be temporary? You old scaremonger, or you, and then things will go back to normal after a while, and there'll be no long-term harm.
Yeah, inflation, life is transitory if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
And inflation is transitory in the sense eventually it ends. The terrible hyperinflation in Germany did eventually end. Our terrible inflation of the 1970s did end. But that tells you nothing. It's like saying airplane crashes are caused by gravity. It doesn't tell you very much. And so, yeah, in that sense, it's transitory. Mm-hmm. But the fact of the matter is it can be cured very quickly once you realize you have a problem, and it does not require crunching an economy like the Brits are about to do, or crazy things like that. All you have to do, what people don't realize, and economists don't seem to grasp, many of them, is that money measures value the way a scale measures weight, or a ruler measures length, or a clock measures time, and it works best when it has a fixed value. Imagine if the Federal Reserve was in charge of the Time Bureau and it decided to float the clock, 60 minutes one day and an hour 32 the next, 98 the day after. Life would be difficult. Or if they floated the pound, not the British pound, but the weighing pound, 16 ounces one day, 18 the next, 10 the day after, it would be a problem. So take the clock. You have a recipe for baking a cake. It says bake the batter for 30 minutes. You have to figure out, are those nominal minutes, inflation adjusted minutes? Are they New York minutes, Mexican minutes, California minutes?
Good point.
It would be very complicated. Well, that's what happens when you have unstable money. It makes long-term investment less likely.
Oh, totally.
And this gets to the very real cost. Until the 1970s, this country had a gold standard. After World War II, it was called the Bretton Woods International Monetary System. Dollar is fixed to gold. That's all it means, is that the value is fixed. Gold, for a variety of reasons, keeps its intrinsic value better than anything else. Not perfect, but better than anything else we've found in the last 4,000 years. But anyway, from the end of World War II, late 40s, we point this out in the book, to the early 70s, late 60s, early 70s, the average growth rate of the American economy was 4.2% a year. Since then, it's gone down to 2.7, probably declining even further. Now, that doesn't sound like much to most people, but you compound that over 50 years, and the results are devastating. We point out the household median income today is about $70,000. If we'd just had our 180-year average growth rate, which went through world wars and depressions and all sorts of political turmoil, just that average growth rate that we had for a while after World War II, if you had that average growth rate, the household median income today would be $110,000 to $115,000. Now, wouldn't people be happier today if you had stable $1 and $40,000 or $45,000 more of income?
Yes.
Life would be a lot better. But that's the price you pay when you start to muck around with money.
The world hasn't progressed that much since then. And you could argue that this low growth, a lot of the technology that exists today existed then. The internet's different, but being a time traveler coming from 1950 to now wouldn't see a lot that he doesn't recognize.
He would see that there are a lot more of us.
Yes.
And we weigh a lot more.
Yes.
Some of us, as we get older, get metabolism challenged.
That's your excuse.
As I can attest. But you mentioned the internet, and by the way, which has profoundly changed things. Imagine bringing somebody back from the dead 30 years ago, 40 years ago, and try to describe the internet.
Yes.
You could not do it. They could not grasp what this thing is.
Yes.
But you hit on something very important, and that is, when people were thinking about the future in the 50s, they're thinking about flying cars and stuff like that.
Yes.
And I think we're now beginning to enter an era, if we get the right environment, right conditions, which I think we will in the next couple of years. Bad times do bring about reforms.
Yes.
Is that we're finally going to hit things like aircraft travel. To build on your point, since jet planes, the time it takes to go, say, from New York to Los Angeles hasn't much changed in the last half century. And I think we're going to see some big changes. High tech is finally going to hit the physical things instead of just bits. It's going to hit physical things, and you're going to see some profound physical changes so that somebody coming back will say, wow.
I wonder, because as you say, when you can't know what it's going to cost in 1 year's time, and 5 years' time, and 10 years' time. I know someone recently who was thinking of buying a historic building for a couple of $100,000, spending another couple of $100,000, and he decided not to do it because he didn't know what the prices of construction materials and labor was going to be next year. And we're talking about a small little building project that was cancelled because of that. Think of all the other investments and all the other innovations that are being cancelled because companies will not put the billions or trillions needed into it, or tens of billions into it, because of inflation. So
that hits something very, very important too, and that is when you have unstable currency, you get less long-term productive investment because you don't know what you're going to get back. And so we don't. And without investment, you don't get a higher standard of living.
Yes.
You can invent something. The Chinese, thousands of years ago, invented some great stuff, but they didn't have a free market. They didn't have the capital markets that we have. And so the stuff just remained curiosities instead of turning into everyday products that we can't live without.
What would be your advice to ordinary people to cope with this new reality that seems to be?
Or is it a new reality?
Well, it's happening right now. What is the advice to ordinary people who, by the way, Phil, I mean, obviously we can wait for another election and hopefully elect better people or whatever. But in the meantime, what is the advice for ordinary people with savings, with, paying mortgages off, trying to put kids in college, all that kind of? What's your advice to ordinary people? What do they do with this situation?
We mentioned that back in the 1970s, Forbes ran a cover story saying how to protect and profit from inflation. And then we began the story by saying we have to tell you the truth. In inflation, most people aren't going to be able to fully protect themselves. That's what's so insidious about it.
Yeah.
And yes, you can buy hard assets, but then you have to worry about when they start to fight the inflation. What works when you have rising prices does not work when you have stable prices. Back in the 1980s, for example, when inflation was conquered, the energy industry went through a depression.
That's right.
The agriculture industry went through a depression. A lot of those assets that did well during the 70s bombed in the 80s. Fortunately, we had a good economic environment, so the country grew, even though places like Texas and Iowa were going through hard times. So in terms of the meantime, all you can do is try to, and everyone's doing it, look for the generics rather than the brand, and you have to make some choices. And one of the things I would recommend to younger people, especially younger, that is you're 50 or under. That's young for me now. and if for your retirement funds, keep putting the money in. Obviously, you have a reserve because you never know what's going to come your way, but keep investing the money because eventually this country always comes back because we're still a free people, despite the best efforts of some to take it away. And when it does come back, then the shares you bought at a low price, what they call dollar cost averaging, you'll do just fine. And so you have to recognize emotions. When it comes to investing, emotions are your enemy. Everyone says they're a good long-term disciplined investor until the market goes down.
Yes.
Then you wonder, is it too late to get out?
When you ain't got a lot, losing a lot, some of it is a lot of it.
Yes.
And it's a bloodbath at the moment over here. And we're just going, we're not putting our...
What do we do?
We're not putting our hard-earned money into that bloodbath again. But you're saying put it in because it's cheaper now.
But you're young. You're younger than I am by a wide margin.
Thank
and
you,
so
sir.
therefore, you should put the money in because eventually it turns. You can have a long dry period like we had from the late 60s to the early 80s, but eventually it turns. And the problem is you never get the timing right. Even if you get it right by getting out, you don't know when it's going to turn. A big example was back in 2009 when the market had gone down over 50%, 55%, and the economy was terrible, the recovery was slow. No one in March of 2009 realized that something happened in Congress that finally turned the market around. They made a change in how banks had to value their capital, very arcane subject, which was devastating unnecessarily bank capital, destroying them. We got rid of that rule during the Depression. Finally, in 2009, in March, we got rid of it again, and nobody realized the significance of it. That's when the bear market turned. At the time, the S&P was about 666, 670, and even at today's levels, it's still 5 or 6 times what it was then. So you're never going to get the market timing right. So for your non-retirement money, stick to value right now. If you want to have cash, by golly, 1 and 2 year treasuries are amazing. 4.5%, 4 3/4% after years of cheating you. Your cash is finally earning something. But in your retirement fund, keep that reserve, but also stay in there. And eventually a free country will get itself out of the mess.
Okay.
And so that sounds Pollyannish, but I am old enough to remember the 70s when we had malaise and we were a declining nation. And who would have thought that the Soviet Union was seen as the rising world power?
Wow.
1970s.
Yeah.
That barely a decade later, they'd be in the ash heap of history.
It's interesting you just mentioned that. That's very interesting because I'm on my mind. A question I'd love to ask you, and I think we could talk to you forever, and we'd love to talk to you again. China. ? You know the way they used to do that to you in school, where they would write a big paragraph and then say discuss. I feel like just saying to you, China ? Discuss. You know, as I said, I'm extremely uneducated on world economies, but I got a swift education during COVID, and not a good one. And particularly one thing that's really struck me and really continues to really bother me is the fact that all the drugs in all the world that keep all of us going, and that, you know, people with cancer treatments and people with everything, and drugs for diabetes and heart disease, that all of them are made in China. How, like, to me, that it's so irresponsible and mad. It makes me scared about the fact that this is who runs the world. All the world leaders allowed this to happen, including the Americans. That's just one part of the picture, but for me, it's a huge thing. Discuss.
There is technology out there that can swiftly make drugs here. Okay. And I think you're going to see a real boom in that. Okay. Yes. And because drug companies have always focused on innovating the drug, and they've sort of just left the manufacturing aside, not much interested in it. Yep. But suddenly, because of circumstance, they're beginning to realize, yes, we have to start paying attention to the manufacturing side, not just to the development side. And so I think you're going to see some big breakthroughs with in terms of pills and the like. A little harder with the liquids, but making revolutions on not just trying to take what's in China and put it in the U.S. That's not going to get you very far. But new ways of doing things, innovative ways of doing things. So not only do we make it, but we steal a march on it. For example, back in the 80s, there was huge concern that countries like Japan and South Korea were making chips cheaper than we were. Well, commodity chips, yes. But it turns out, despite the worries of Intel and others, that the real money is made in the architecture of chips that can do advanced devices like eventually iPads and iPhones and these devices, personal computers and the like. That's where the margin was from. So commodity chip, South Korea can do it very nicely. But the really complicated stuff, which Intel did for years until recently very well, was on the innovative side. So on the manufacturing side, and probably you're going to have to count on outside entrepreneurs to look at this thing and say, this is a huge opportunity. Yes. It's been ignored because it just wasn't that important before, and find ways to do it.
Yeah.
Okay, I suppose
the Chinese have the advantage, by the way, of slave labor, which is very hard to compete with.
Well, I think.
It's other than picking cotton as they did in the old days, workers have to be satisfied or feel they have a chance to get ahead.
Okay.
And free people are much more innovative. Yeah. And one of the things that Xi Jinping, if we don't get in a war in the next few years, is doing to his country is by putting party apparatchiks in all businesses now. There are no free entrepreneurs anymore. He's going to wreck the economy.
Of course he is.
Or put it in stagnation. Yeah. And you'd think, given China's history of what happened when they stagnated before and what that led to, they would shrink in horror from what Xi Jinping is doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there is a time limit on China, but hopefully it's sooner rather than later, Okay, I'm going to be the adult in the room and get us back to the book. Okay, please. So what do you say to people who say we need a little inflation to keep economies pumping? You know, a little inflation is a wonderful thing, and we need central banks to pump some money into economies to keep the growth moving. You know,
money is like a claim check, and it makes it easier to buy and sell with each other.
Yes.
But when you start to muck around with it, you end up doing harm when you change the value of it. They think it's that nothing else changes. Oh, if we devalue the currency, we'll have more exports and fewer imports. Our balance of trade will improve.
That's right.
forgetting that the U.S. has been in trade imbalance for most of our existence. Put that aside for a moment. The key is those things always end up doing more harm than good. No nation or state ever became great economically by trashing its money. Quite the opposite. And so leave it alone. This idea of 2% inflation, when they got rid of the gold standard, central banks said, well, what do we peg to now? And so in the mid-'80s, in New Zealand, of all places, a business guy who was the head, I think he was in the fishing business, was the head of, they put a civilian in charge of the central bank, said, oh, why don't we peg it to inflation? What rate? Well, 2%. That's above zero. That's how it was done. It wasn't done with elaborate studies or figuring out what's worked in the past. It was just conjured out of thin air. But it's now holy writ, 2% rate of inflation. It's bogus. You don't want inflation or deflation. You want inflation. And the thing is, as we point out in the book, prices will fluctuate because needs and wants and perceptions fluctuate. New things come across, so prices fluctuate. And there may be a time when they may pop up, but then they go popping down. So leave it alone. We don't. And this is one of the great disasters of the Great Depression, other than the huge decline and what it led to, a world war. But the Depression was not caused by inherent flaws in the free market, which is what you're taught in school today, that you can't trust free markets. It was caused by government policy error. And so are free markets perfect? No, nothing involving human beings is perfect. Our founders understood that the flaws of human nature. Lincoln understood it. So you're not going to get perfection, but you're going to get the next best thing. And for people who criticize capitalism or stable money and the like, make it sound like when they do, a lot of these criticisms make it sound like capitalism caused human nature to be so bad. I've got news for them. Bad things were happening long before Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. It wasn't like we had some Garden of Eden until Adam Smith came along and wrecked it all. No, the serpent did in the Garden of Eden.
In fact, you could argue that the world has got a lot more peaceful and less violent since capitalism.
Over time, yes, societies have become generally, even though the headlines would suggest otherwise. The long-term trend is we have become relatively more peaceful. And the key thing is to keep creating the conditions that have us focused on creating things rather than stealing things.
Yeah. I mean, I was going to wind up by asking you what's the solution, but you've sort of touched on it. A return...
Creating things rather than stealing things.
Yes. You returning to the gold standard, the idea that a little inflation is a good thing. That we need... There needs to be no... I mean, to me, actually, this is not really connected to what the book is, but this idea of... actually, you do talk about in the book, raising interest rates to create a recession, to stop inflation. I mean, to me, this is just more of that idea that, the poor people have to suffer so we can fix our mistakes.
And this, I'm glad you touched on this, because why it's now accepted by everyone that the Federal Reserve has the duty of manipulating interest rates. Interest is the rent you pay, the price you pay to rent the money, as they used to say. And we all know rent, or at least some of us know, rent controls distort the market. Well, so do rent controls on borrowing or renting the money distort the market. And what was different in the last generation is the first time central banks, led by ours, not only focused on short-term manipulation, but trying to manipulate long-term rates. They went for zero interest rate policy, thinking that's a way to create prosperity, even though people like John Locke over 300 years ago said if you suppress interest rates, you're going to have problems. Yes, Locke was right, and Ben Bernanke, former head of the Federal Reserve, and all the other central bankers were wrong. And as a result of suppressing interest rates, governments went on borrowing sprees because the money was free. You could borrow and spend, and the cost went down. That's great. And in their minds, a lot of companies went on borrowing sprees. You had people reaching for exotic instruments. FTX is the latest example of that, trying to get, and so totally distorted everything, and it's going to take years to undo a lot of the things were done on the supposition that interest rates were gone forever. No, they're not. And so again, when governments try to help us, watch out.
Yeah, I mean,
I think Ronald Reagan had something to say about that, right? What is it?
Yes.
What was that phrase? Yeah. The worst. What is it? The worst
9 words.
Words in the. Yeah.
I'm from
the government. I'm here to help.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it just strikes me as I mean, and everyone seems to agree that the best thing to do now is to create a recession to drive down interest rates, and I'm just going. That just strikes me as, I mean, and we should keep morality out of economics, maybe, I don't know, but it just strikes me as an immoral thing to do. Does that sound naive? Am I being Pollyanna?
No, not at all. Not at all. It is immoral to create unnecessary pain, and we did this again. It's amazing. After thousands of years of experience with this thing, we still make dumb, crazy, same mistakes, same kind of mistakes. Back in the 1970s, we did the same thing. We created inflation by devaluing the dollar fell in value. So they engineered a recession that brought prices down for a while, because when you're going out of business, you do have going out of business sales and the like, and people can't buy as much. Hello.
Mm-hmm.
And then when prices came down, they went back to undermining the dollar, and we got the disease back again.
Yeah.
And they keep referring to the great recession of the early 1980s about Paul Volcker finally conquering inflation. Yeah, he did put us through a bone-crunching recession, but the big difference between what he did and what happened in the 70s was that after the recession, he relatively stabilized the dollar. And plus, Ronald Reagan's tax cuts and deregulation setting off a production boom, we zoomed ahead.
Yeah.
Unlike the 70s. So it's not the recession that cures inflation, it's stabilizing the currency. That's why I worry about Britain and others once they bring prices down. Oh, inflation's conquered. If you go back to making the same mistakes, like drinking bad water, you're going to get sick again.
Yes. Okay, well, we could talk forever. I just, before we leave, I just wanted to talk to you about one. Actually, the book is called Inflation. Tell us what the book again is called.
Inflation, what it is, why it's bad, and how to fix it. And it's amazing, those 3 simple questions. Most of those who should know better would flunk the test.
Yeah. Wow. So, Mr. Forbes, I just wanted to talk to you about the Forbes 400 Rich List and my admiration for it. And it's not just an admiration as a consumer; it's an admiration as someone who knows a little bit about rich lists, because back in my past, I was a journalist for the UK Sunday Times, which has a famous UK-based rich list. I assume it was a rip-off of your Forbes 400. But
yes, and we can't get fees for that.
No
royalties.
So
even though Britain has a monarchy, no royalties for this.
Well, let King Charles do his worst, and I'm sure in a few years there'll be no monarchy there either. Talk about devaluing something.
Okay, move on.
Okay, so when I don't want to diss my former colleagues too much, but let me just tell you, I was tangentially involved in the Irish part of the rich list, and it was a remarkably, shockingly casual process.
A work of fiction, one might say.
No.
Well, creative. Was it very creative then, rather than?
No, it was fact-based fiction.
Okay.
And definitely it was. I was surprised by the lack of rigor, and I then assumed that all rich lists were created equal.
And then you came to America.
Then I came to America, and I saw the Forbes, and I saw Kylie Jenner. Who was the youngest billionaire, self-made billionaire, etc., and it was on Forbes. And then I saw the Forbes article, perhaps maybe a year, 18 months later, and the headline just shocked me to the core, actually, because you seldom see newspapers or periodicals not admit they were got wrong or admit they were conned or whatever, but the line was how Kylie Jenner committed fraud to get herself on the Forbes 400 list. And that was a great story in itself, how she created false tax returns to show to you guys. But what also surprised me was that you guys went to that length of demanding tax returns, demanding financial statements, which made me think, oh, this is a genuine list and people should take it seriously.
Well, we've tried over the years to make it as accurate as possible. And one of the things that you have to keep in mind, and the politicians keep forgetting this, many of them, is being rich does not mean you have a pile of cash. There was once a Disney character called Scrooge McDuck that had a money bin full of cash and gold and jewelry and the like. Most wealth is not cash. Most wealth is the value of the asset you have. And what can be worth something someday, people's preferences change, and they're not worth much tomorrow. Schumpeter called about creative destruction. Capital is always being destroyed in a dynamic market. And so in terms of the list, we talk to competitors, we try to talk to bankers, we try to make it the estimates, and that's what they are, accurate as possible, and also recognize that things can change rather dramatically, as we're starting to see in the whole crypto world.
Phelim is obsessed with that story, by the way, the FTX story.
Oh, well, it's I'm obsessed with it for many reasons, but I think the whole what's that, altruistic capitalism? I mean, it's just it's awful. I mean, capitalism is the most altruistic form of organizing. You don't. But need...
I have to say, I've definitely enjoyed reading Mr. Fried. I love the name, by the way. Mr. Fried talking about ESG. And basically, blowing the lid on that and saying, well, it's all bullshit, actually, I mean, it's kind of funny. And who did he give that interview to? Vox, yeah.
And he also gave it to a journalist who's a big proponent of ESG.
Oh, yeah, it's great.
So
yeah. Well, although I'm not sure how many people are listening to anything he has to say now, but interesting coming from him that he just says, that's just, he played lip service to that.
Well, in closing, in terms of talking about, you mentioned morality earlier, is that people wonder, they think of commerce on one side and philanthropy on the other side, and not realize the paradox of the U.S., which is the most commercial nation ever invented, but also the most philanthropic. And really, commerce and philanthropy, both about meeting the needs and wants of others, are two sides of the same coin.
Very interesting, because obviously this is Thanksgiving week, and we're actually about to do a whole thing thanking our donors, by the way. And exactly to your point, that we got to make this movie, My Son Hunter, because people, donors from all over the country gave money, and America is this unbelievably benevolent place where people are really, really generous about doing the things that they think are worthwhile and devoting their money to that.
Well, on that upbeat note, I think we should end this interview. Thank you very much, Mr. Forbes.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Grateful. It's been fun, actually.
Yes.
And
I've enjoyed it and look forward to seeing you in person soon.
We'd love that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All the best.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Well, we could have talked forever there.
Yes. I mean, I know we went off on a lot of different tangents during that interview, but actually, it's very difficult to not do that when you're talking to the great Steve Forbes, who has so many interesting things to say about so many. And it's like, I want to know what he, while we're listening to him, it's like, I want to know what he thinks about this and what he thinks about that. But and hopefully we will get to speak to him again. But again, and the information about how to get his book will be in the show notes, so do go there.
Well, Hollywood hell, and that, I'm not talking about the amount of time it takes to get a movie made.
This is incredible.
I'm talking about the people who have to watch this nonsense.
Yes.
So there's a new movie out called She Said, which is the story of the New York Times, quote unquote, investigation into the Harvey Weinstein matters.
And by the way, just to mention to you, as some of you may not know, we made a podcast. We went to the trial of Harvey Weinstein every day
in New York,
and we had actors reenact the most dramatic moments from that trial every day, and we put that out as a podcast. It's available for free. You can still listen to it, and it was incredibly popular at the time. What's the name of our podcast, Phelim?
The Harvey Weinstein Trial Unfiltered.
Yes. So now
they've made a movie about the investigation, which is by the way, completely one-sided. But anyone who sat through the trial realized that there was a lot of holes in the victim's accounts.
Incredible.
He was convicted, we should add, but a lot of the stories just didn't add up, and you could wonder, was it mob justice or was it justice? But anyway, they made this movie. they always say movies about newspapers never do well, but they do. Spotlight did well. I think this is a boring.
All the President's not is it what's it called? All the President's Men.
All the President's Men. This is a boring movie about a subject. Anyway, it's woke upon woke upon woke, and it's to say it did badly. It opened in 2,000 theaters and earned approximately 830,000 on Friday.
Unheard of.
This is to quote the Hollywood Reporter. This would mark one of the worst openings in recent memory, excluding the pandemic, for a major studio release opening in more than 2,000 locations. Universal believes it was important to make it, right? But it has one of the worst sells. And, this is another one. This is in Variety, I believe. She said has a lot of company when it comes to well-reviewed movies, well-reviewed. Their friends liked it.
Yeah.
And by the way,
that's the thing that we've highlighted this before, where you have Rotten Tomatoes and the score from the critics is like 98%, and then the score from the audience is like 4.
Yeah. But also, it's like, if you read the reviews, they're not that well reviewed. They're kind of they say this is an important movie and this actor's good, but they always talk about the topic and never the movie, because they can't talk about the movie because it's just
the movie's
boring.
So dreadful.
But then one by one, this year's crop of this I love. One by one, this year's crop of Oscar contenders have flopped or at least underperformed.
Oh, that's a great. By the way, I love that. That's everything you need to know about the Oscars. By the way, right?
By the way,
there in one sentence.
By the way, journalists, maybe they shouldn't be Oscar contenders now.
Yeah, and it's funny, in the midst of all of that, there's one movie that's done really, really well in the box office and continues to break every kind of possible record. Yes. Top Gun, which I don't think was nominated for anything, right?
And you could have tried My Son Hunter too, put it in the box office, but no, that wasn't offered.
That was never going to happen.
They talk about Tar, right? Which
I've never heard of it.
It's that one about the conductor. Is it Kate Blanchett or somebody like that? Tar, a drama about sexual harassment in the world of classical music that has eked out 4.9 million in 7 weeks of release. Basically, their friends and family went. And then Armageddon Time, a coming-of-age film to generate 1.8 million. Triangle of Sadness.
Oh, God. Imagine, I'm tired, it's Friday night. Honey, I really want to go to the movie. Oh, you know what? Let's go and see Triangle of Sadness. Oh, my God, what's that about?
Well, you want to know what it's about?
I'd love to know, Phil, what it's about.
It is a satirical look at the 1%.
Okay, go on.
At rich people. A satirical... I mean, no one's ever thought of that before. Be satirical about rich people. Yeah. I've just never...
Imagine, in all my years.
I want to go and learn something fresh. So anyway, they're all doing really badly. Even the movie Till, which is about Emmett Till, 8.5 million. Nothing. Right? Nothing. However, interesting, The Chosen...
Oh yeah,
and by the way, Chosen was a Fandango event, only 1 weekend only, and it's something that took 9 million. It was going to be the number 2 movie. Another movie may have just beaten it. It was either the number 2 or number 3 movie of the weekend.
And you remember Chosen? We had Dallas Jenkins. We interviewed Dallas Jenkins in the past, who is the producer, I suppose. Is he the producer director of the Chosen series, which is a magnificent idea, by the way. You can watch The Chosen through the app The Chosen, which you can get in the App Store, and you can watch the whole series for free about the life of Jesus. And they ask you at the end, do you want to pay it forward? Do you want to donate something to let other people watch it? And that model has worked brilliantly for them, to the extent that they're now at series, what film? 3?
Yes, season 3.
Yeah. Brilliant. But I think that this is so interesting. So in the midst of all these Hollywood movies that have spent gazillions of dollars, all very worthy, about awful, about topics no one has any interest in, you find what people really want to see, and what
it was Maverick and The Chosen.
Maverick and The Chosen, and Maverick is kind of, I think that sort of feel good, very patriotic, nostalgic, very unwoke. There's nothing. I don't think there's anything woke at all in Top Gun, and people actually like it. It's like it's that old-fashioned feel-good movie, basically. And bizarrely people want to see it, and not bizarrely at all. Actually, people want to read and learn more and watch more about the life of Jesus Christ. So
talking of people wanting to see things, Disney's had enormous shock to the system.
Oh yes.
Their CEO Bob Chapek has been basically fired. It's another example of she said. It's this adopting the woke agenda, and people don't really like it. And there's
So what did the CEO do wrong?
Well, this CEO. The headline thing he did was Ron DeSantis brought in you're not allowed to indoctrinate children about sexuality up to the age of 8 or something like that. Some minor thing like that. You're not allowed to talk to them about sex up to then, or indoctrinate them about other things, and which then they call "Don't Say Gay."
Which doesn't feature anywhere in the legislation.
And Bob Chapek said, we're not getting involved in this. And he had such a backlash from executives and activisty staff. Then he came out and condemned it. And then Ron DeSantis turned around and basically has made it a campaign to punish Disney for challenging that, and has cost Chapek a lot of money, a lot of bad PR, because he's now siding with the groomers, not the parents. And then you had things like in Lightyear, which is which was supposed to be Buzz Lightyear and Toy Story, the prequel, having a gay kiss in Lightyear. A gay kiss in Lightyear. And Lightyear cost $200 million to make. It's taken $226 million at the box office. So it's
complete disaster.
Complete disaster. Then you have people like Carrie Burke, who is herself. This is a video of her. She's a Disney corporate president, Carrie Burke, herself a proud mother of, quote, one transgender child and one pansexual child. And she's lobbied Disney to include many LGBTQIA characters in its stories. And she's called for 50% of Disney characters to be either LGBTQIA or racial minorities. Now, rather than firing Carrie Burke, right, they say, yeah, how can we help? So, not surprisingly, people have been staying away from Disney in droves, and Mr. Chapek has paid the price. Now, they brought in Bob Iger, who's seen as a steadier pair of hands and won't. But don't forget, this is also an organization that ruined Star Wars by making it woke. Star Wars was one of the most profitable franchises on the planet, and now it's reduced to a pretty good TV series, Mandalorian. The Star Wars universe is dead cinematically because they made it woke, and they
made it woke instead of making it good.
Yes, and reduced Luke Skywalker to a mopey kind of millennial sitting on a rock going "woe is me," as opposed to being a warrior. And never really explained why he's sitting on the rock all mopey, but he was. It was just, they made it woke is unwatchable. Disney proved that, and now they're paying the price. You know who's suffering the most in this? Do you know who's doing now? Obviously, the guy who got fired ain't happy, but there's a certain other guy in Florida who won't be happy with this.
Go on.
Donald Trump. This is Ron DeSantis having a victory lap. He took on Disney
and won. Indeed. Okay, Phelan, we have an interview coming up.
Oh, we do. Yes, we have an interview with Megan. This will make you think twice about everything you think you know about the developing world and helping children there, and why you should never, ever, ever donate to an orphanage in the developing world or in America, by the way.
And I know that sounds really shocking to people, but you're going to understand it a little bit better after this interview.
So we're going over now to Megan Boudreaux, who runs a not-for-profit in Haiti, and we're going to hear her experiences, and we're going to tell you our experiences of dealing with orphanages in the developing world. So let's go over there now to that interview we did just before we came on. So we're very happy to be joined now by Megan Boudreaux. I hope I pronounced her name correctly. Yes. She has founded Respire Haiti, a non-profit in Haiti, and she's transformed a barren hillside into a refuge, including a school for 500 children, a medical clinic, and the reason we have Megan on the show today is we're going to tell you something very shocking, that and I mentioned it in the introduction, that giving money to orphanages is one of the worst uses of your philanthropic money, and you are not only and I'm going to be very blunt here, you're not only wasting your money, but you're contributing to the destruction of families in the developing world. And I know that's a hard thing to say, but Megan, we know it from our experience of living in Romania post Ceausescu. Megan is based in Haiti, and what attracted me to Megan was I just accidentally found her Instagram page where she talks about this a lot, and I think TikTok as well. And I wanted people, because I know we have a lot of listeners out there who give money to orphanages in the developing world, and they even go and work in orphanages and volunteer in orphanages, and we wanted to talk to them respectfully about why that is not the proper use of your time or energy. So, welcome to the show, Megan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So, Megan, you're based in Louisiana now, but for many, many years you were in Haiti, and you still run an organization in Haiti. Tell us about the organization you run first.
Sure. Yes, I lived in Haiti from 2011 until 2020, and then my family and I kind of got stuck here. The airports closed down. We were in the States, and we weren't able to get back to Haiti. So it's kind of been an interesting journey. It wasn't a decision we necessarily made, but luckily, our organization has a great group of Haitian leadership team that is just in charge of all of our programs. So we run a school with now over 600 kids. We have a medical clinic and sports programs. We do physical and occupational therapy and mental health therapy. So there's a lot of different programs that we do, and thankfully, without even with us not being able to be there, all of them are still running.
So you run a school, not an orphanage. Explain to people why orphanages
Are a bad idea.
are a bad idea.
I'll start with my personal story. I think that's kind of how all of these things begin, is like we've got
Yes.
a personal experience with it, and then it affects us, and then we want to share it with others. So back in 2011, I visited an orphanage, and it was very heartbreaking. The kids didn't have food. There wasn't enough mattresses. There weren't enough clothes for the children. And so when I visited that, I saw this great big church come in and buy all these mattresses and drop them off, and give clothes and give food and all of these things. And so I just thought, wow, this is awesome. This is great that they're supporting this orphanage, and that they care so much. So the next week goes by and the team leaves. They go back to the States. And I, who was living in Haiti, was like, I'm going to stop by and see how they're doing. So I go to the same orphanage, and there's nothing. There's no mattresses. There's no clothes. There's no food. And I thought, wow, that's really odd. So I started to try and figure out, okay, what happened? Like, did they sell it? Did they need it? Is it hidden? And I started kind of making regular visits, and pretty much every time I would go, I would find either a team there that was bringing supplies, or I'd find a barren orphanage with nothing in there. And so it didn't take too long before I realized that, unfortunately, this man was running a business. So I kind of shared my concerns with a couple of the bigger churches that were going, and we decided to kind of do an assessment of the kids that were there. And what we found was that the turnover of the children was ridiculous. I mean, there was 100 kids in there, but it was almost a different 100 children every time. And so that kind of propelled me into really researching, like, who are these kids? Do they have families? How did they end up in these orphanages? What's their story? And so it's kind of brought me to present day, and that just propelled me forward. And the research out there, which there is actually a lot of research on orphanages in the world, is that between 80 and 92% of children in orphanages have at least one living parent. And so I think that kind of is, the beginning of the confusion. We think orphanages, we think orphan, we think orphan, we think, either biblically speaking, or just even the definition that it's a child that has no family.
Yes.
And that's just not the case.
Yeah, and this was the same in Romania. And look, as you say, there's a lot of literature out there. Like, there are reports from 1922 and 1920s and late 1800s in the UK. Orphanages are bad for children, damaging for children,
and very expensive.
And they're the most expensive way to
a
look
much
after
more
them.
expensive way than And so, the research from the UK from way back in the day was, we need to close down these orphanages, and the money we're spending there, give it to families. But I think going back, just to emphasize again what you said earlier, because I think that's the really big piece here, is that orphanages, what's called orphanages, are not full of orphans. And to be an orphan is very, very unusual. It's incredibly unusual to lose both your parents. That's very, very unusual to happen. For a start. But then, as you kind of say, in a bigger sense, to lose not only both your parents, but all of every part of your family is very, very unusual, particularly in the developing world, where people have large families.
Yes.
Right.
And so, but Anyway, sorry.
No, actually, this is a good point. To lose both your parents would be very unusual. To lose both your parents and all your extended family would be very unusual. But also, even if you had your extended family, to have an extended family that would not take in a genuine orphan somewhere within that extended family, there would have to be this, that is very unusual. That.
So what's happening? So why is this happening?
Yeah. So, I mean, truthfully, it's happening because unfortunately, people, want the instant gratification of trying to help, and, it comes from well-intentioned people that want to support children. Ultimately, I believe that's why so many people support all these orphanages. But at the end of the day, they're missing the connection and the point that actually by supporting these orphanages and pouring so much money into them, that they're separating children from their families.
Yes.
Yeah,
I think Phelim, I'll remember, because Phelim and I were involved in this story quite a bit when we were in Romania, and I remember Phelim made a very good point, which I'll now make it sound like it's my own. But Phelim basically said, it's for a donor, it's very hard to put a plaque on a reunited child. So you have one reunited child with the extended family, or with the mother who was got separated through some storm or whatever happened. You can't put a plaque on that child, but you can put a plaque on a massive building where you have 700 children who you're calling orphans. And the person who gave the money could feel kind of good about that, because they can identify it, they can see it, as opposed to
So I mean, the figures in Romania were startling. I mean, it was costing hundreds of dollars a month to keep a child in a building, to fund the building, separated from, let's say, his mother, who was poorer, right? Hundreds of dollars a month. For $20 a month, you could support that parent, that child's mother or grandmother or aunt directly, and the child would be in its family. So it's not even that this makes financial sense. So the donor's money is actually being wasted. You would be more effective as a donor if you give money
to reunite the families.
To reunite families.
Absolutely. Yeah. And in Haiti, one of the biggest, draws that parents, look at when it comes to orphanages is schooling, is education. Like many developing countries, like many, countries all over the world, education is not free. And so when you're looking at this, orphanage that just, popped up in your neighborhood, and they're offering free education, and they've got meals, and they're providing uniforms and books and all of these things, then of course, as a mother, wouldn't you want to have your child in school? Yes. And so that's where the unintentional coercion comes in, and the unintentional misinformation of, these people come in, they think that they need to be building an orphanage. And, we always say, this is true pretty much everywhere. If you build it, they will come. If you build an orphanage for 50 kids, you'll fill it with 50. 500, you'll fill it with 500. And so the hard piece is that, a lot of these children are there because their parents actually do care for them and cannot offer them what this orphanage is offering them.
Yes. If you, and it's a supply and demand based industry as well.
But I think, a couple of points. One, to go back just to the kind of the history of this as well. I think one of the things that possibly a lot of people listening probably didn't know was that every country in the world had orphanages. Ireland had them, and every town in Ireland had an orphanage. Every town in Britain, in France. So in the world that's now been called the developed world, every town had an orphanage, and they didn't get rid of the orphanages because poverty was eradicated. That wasn't the reason that they got rid of them. They got rid of them because they were bad for children. So I think so that the history of childcare in the world discovered this, and yet that lesson got unlearned by charities going forward. How did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, and that's the most, confusing part about all of this, is that we've got the research, we've got the statistics. There's a plethora of it out there that talks about the mental, emotional, psychological problems that are caused by orphanages, that talks about the attachment disorders and the trust issues that come from having constant visitors or rotating caregivers. I mean, there's really honestly no research that talks about orphanages being an environment that's healthy for children. And I think that at the end of the day, this is a question I get all the time on Instagram, on Reels and emails, but what about the good orphanages? And it's really hard to explain this in a very gentle and kind way, but they're not any good orphanages. No. You can't pick the best of the worst. In its institution, in its entity, orphanages are just not healthy places for children. Yes, so you can't quantify, this one's better because they get, a couple more meals than this one does. It doesn't work like that.
And you just to take a, looking at your own story. So you're working in Haiti, and I'm going to presume, and I don't know the Haiti story, but I'm imagining in Haiti then there are quite a number of orphanages. Is that correct?
Oh yes, I mean thousands of orphanages. Yeah,
Yeah.
So
there's a lot.
so I mean, have you had difficulty getting your story out there, by the way, and telling this story?
It's a little bit more challenging because, especially in Haiti, people love to say, "Oh, that might happen and work in other parts of the world, but it won't work in Haiti." And I think
Yes.
the hard piece is that people have to understand. Like, I mean, it's a marathon; it's not a sprint. You're not going to close every orphanage and suddenly everything's better.
Mhm.
You've got to really unlearn, teach a lot
Yes.
of the community to unlearn that, hey, these foreigners who have come in and provided this,
Yes.
that, and the other, that's our saving grace. I mean, it's very unfortunate, but the mindset of Haitians has just kind of been a little bit convoluted because of the help that they're offering,
Yes.
not realizing that as a society as a whole, there's just a lot lacking, especially when you're talking about these kids turning 18. What do they do when they turn 18? I mean, most of them honestly just end up on the street. So what are
Yeah.
you really helping? Like, how are you really breaking this cycle? You're not.
Well, I mean, the question to ask people who may come to our listeners looking for money for their orphanage in Haiti, ask them what American model is their orphanage based on.
Hmm.
So,
Or
you know,
what world class
well,
model?
no, let's say you live in Oklahoma and you're at a fundraiser for an orphanage in Haiti. Ask what can you show me an American city or town where a similar model exists for children? And if not, why are Haitian children different from American children? And of course, they'll tell you, oh, well, it's different in
Well, it's
Haiti.
abject poverty. They're going to say that it's abject poverty and all of that. That's what they're going to say.
But surely my money then should be on the. Are you trying to say that Haitian families are different? Haitian women are different. Haitian extended families are different because it sounds like you are, because your money would be better spent on in a very micro level, um, assisting them bring this child into the family, as opposed to putting it in this damaging institution.
Right. And I think that that's the piece where, it's easy to kind of start nitpicking and say, well, what about, special needs children in Haiti? There's a lot that's around like culturally and just, they believe that there's myths of voodoo and this and that for children that have special needs. And so, a lot of Haitians or people that work with Haitian people will say, well, there still needs to be orphanages for special needs kids. Well, Respire Haiti, we have physical and occupational therapy for hundreds of kids, and we
Mhm.
have ensured that children stay in their families. And here's how we do it: by educating and supporting these families.
Mhm.
Please find a family in the United States that has a special needs child that doesn't have support or the ability to have support through churches,
Yes.
through organizations, through
Yes.
you need that support. So how are we expecting Haitians to keep children that have special needs without offering them any sort of support? And that's what we've seen is we have had, I mean, I think over the last 11 years, we've had only 3 children relinquished. And I mean, this is talking about probably over 600 children.
Mhm.
These families want to keep their kids. They want
Yes.
their children in their
Sure.
lives. They just need the help and the
Yes.
resources, which we all do.
And they don't need to be told by wealthy Americans from the developed world that orphanages are acceptable. Because if they're told by wealthy people from the developed world that this is an acceptable model of childcare, why wouldn't they
They're
believe it?
inclined to believe it. They're inclined to believe it.
Right.
As you say, that all the resources are being spent, and it's like a mother in a poor country is going to think, well, I want my child to have the very best, and over there's a lovely school, and it's all the lovely books, and they've got the lovely all the money's been spent over in that building. I want my kid in there because
We
that's where all the stuff
Do
is.
you remember that orphanage in Romania where the children were being sent to Germany for fundraisers and for holidays, for these holidays, but and their mother was living down the street.
Yeah.
So there was thousands of dollars being sent to these children to on these holidays, which are really fundraising holidays,
Mm-hmm.
so that parents become attached to the children.
Wow, that's yeah. I mean, in the beginning of Respray, we saw that a lot when we, as soon as we had, we started school with 75 kids. The second year we had 360, and then by the third year we had over 500. And
Wow.
so we would do intensive home studies, interviews, trying to figure out what's the dynamic of this child. We work with a lot of child slaves in Haiti, which is known as Restavex, and it's basically children who do all the cleaning, cooking, and they live with people that are not their families. A lot of times they're also in orphanages. So we were really trying to get down to what is the quality of life for these children. And in the midst of doing that, we found at least a dozen children who had siblings that were in orphanages. And the parents would come to us and they would say, hey, now that, these two children are in this school, can you help me get my child out of this orphanage?
Yeah.
And
That
the
sounds
orphanage
very
would be
familiar.
down the street.
Yeah.
And it was extremely heartbreaking because I remember interviewing this one girl who is probably like 13, brilliant. I mean, graduated from Respray. Now she's got one of our scholarships. She's doing secondary school, brilliant. And she told me, I would rather have been at home starving than living away from my family in an orphanage. But get this, why did they send her to an orphanage? Because her mom noticed she was brilliant and wanted her to have an education.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
isn't that backwards? It was so confusing.
Yeah.
And I realized right then, like, this is something that needs to be shared because people are going the wrong way down the wrong path to try and help children.
An orphanage with no orphans. That was kind of that's kind of if there's one thing I'd love to come out of this interview for people who are listening, for them to know that at the very beginning that these institutions full of children that are called orphanages are not full of orphans. That should end it. And I remember reading though the UN parsing some of this, and of course one of the things that these groups have done, if they've reinvented the definition of orphan, you probably know that they call them social orphans. I think that's what they call it or whatever. And it's some kind of really vacuous kind of it's a very cover-all kind of phrase to allow them actually to grab children, because
Right.
it can mean anything basically.
Well,
That they didn't want it to make
the
it
children
mean.
are profit centers, and I don't mean that in a.
Mhm.
Some people are good, some people are bad, and some people running these orphanages are great people. Some of them aren't, but they are ultimately profit centers.
Right.
There's so many jobs and so much money depending on getting a body on a bed in an orphanage.
Right. And I mean, it used to be called poverty orphans, and it was like, wait a second, who is the person that is distinguishing the
Yes.
amount of poverty a child's living in? And to me, that was frustrating because I've seen it over and over again in Haiti where an American or a foreigner comes in and establishes that they think these children are too poor to be living with their families
Yeah,
and that they can offer something better. And I mean, it's breaking families apart. And then what
Yeah.
happens is once you've got enough time, where this child is experiencing living in a building that's got electricity all the time or got running water or got meals that are
yeah,
coming out like clockwork, all of
Sure.
these amenities, then it does become something that's not in sync with the culture of Haiti, and that is
Correct.
super challenging because how do you expect to ever reunify these children with their families when all of this is convoluted in the mix?
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. It kind of creates. It's actually alienating children, unnecessarily alienating children, and exactly as you say, yeah, because they've suddenly been exposed to this.
And we should point out, it's I think I remember back in Romania, the figure was it's 4 times cheaper to keep that child in a family than it is in an orphanage.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's a waste of money, and
It's not solving
and it's
poverty.
breaking families up.
And breaking families up, and of course the damage done, that alienation and that damage, institutionalizing children, and all that comes with that.
Well, that's great.
That's generational. That's generational.
But it's also
then.
great fodder for the Haitian gangs too. An alienated young child out of an institution, perfect place for gangs to find members.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that and, when children are out on the street, who do they turn to? I mean, it becomes this cycle that actually puts the child worse off, for maybe 16, 18 years of their life. They have this one experience and then they move on and they've got no attachment. They're not attached to society and as a whole. How do they become a productive citizen when they haven't ridden public transportation? They don't understand, life outside the walls. There's a lot of kids who they go to school, they go to the medical clinic, they do everything within the four walls of that orphanage.
Wow.
And then suddenly they're, asked to leave. It's a problem that I think in the interim, a lot of people feel good because they can see their support. They can see a child that was malnourished and then suddenly, is healthy, or they can see a child that wasn't
Yep.
in school and now they're in school. But the piece that's missing is the fact that most of the time that can be done with the child still in their family.
Yeah.
Yes.
And that's really like the piece that's missing.
Yes.
Can you, just for our listeners and viewers, can you tell us how do they find you? How can people find you? Where do people find out more about your organization and what you guys do?
Sure. Our organization's on Facebook and Instagram, and our website, it's respirehaiti.org. I also do Instagram reels. I'm not on TikTok, but I am on Instagram. And that's Megan in Haiti. And I try and do, videos. I did a couple of them, a while back, and people responded really well and wanted to ask more questions, wanted more information. And so I started doing reels on Instagram to try and, educate and hopefully engage people in conversation. Because, I'm not saying this is something that's going to be fixed right away or something that's, a quick fix, but I am saying let's open the conversation. And especially like you guys said, for donors and churches, let's start figuring out, how we can work on this problem, because it's actually not working.
Yeah. No, that's. I mean, it's very. I mean, I can imagine for people listening to this, it'll be complete mind bending, and it is the experience that we've had before, because, good people are trying to do the right thing, and they've possibly been supporting orphanages, unknowing of what the truth is behind them and how very wrong they are.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Megan.
Really appreciate
really
your time.
appreciate it, and I'll be very interested in the response we get to this interview.
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you guys.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
So, I mean, we spent 7 years in Romania, but we've looked at orphanages in Cambodia, Vietnam, Indonesia. We did a lot of, people don't know this, we did a lot of research on the whole child issue.
And we made a lot of documentaries.
As well.
But I think, again, the point that was made during the interview that I think is the point that people should hang on to is, why are we forcing a model of childcare on the developing world that we decided in the developed world was a complete disaster?
By the way,
why would we do that?
We decided when this was not the developed world. Like in Britain, they were closing orphanages in the 30s when there was a lot of poverty, a lot more poverty than there is now. And in America, they were doing it in the 30s and 40s.
Like,
and 50s.
I'm from a very small town in Ireland, and there was a major orphanage in the small town that I was from.
Ireland was very late to the show closing orphanages, but they closed them in the 60s.
All of the childcare research that has been done forever is absolutely conclusive about this. Like, there's no air at all, right, where they've said that institutionalizing children is always the worst choice. And here we are exporting the worst choice to the developing world. It couldn't be worse. So we thought it was important to bring that. And I know for some people it's going to be very hard to have heard some of the stuff that we heard there in that interview. But and we'll come back to this again. But and do write, by the way, and be in touch.
And ask questions.
Because we're very happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you.
So, we're coming to the end of the show, but there was a couple of headlines this week that I saw that I just thought I wanted to bring to people. Just again, obviously the environment and the environmental movement is something that we focus on quite a bit. But a fabulous headline in the BBC this week, unbelievable. There's a photograph there. You can see the photograph of the guy here, and the headline is "Staying Warm. What does an unheated room do to your body?" So the BBC are now starting to run articles asking, what are we going to do when the lights go out and when the heat goes out all over the UK, as it will go out all over the UK, all over France, Germany, etc., if there's a bad winter and they haven't got enough energy
because they wouldn't frag.
And basically, they send off their intrepid reporter James Gallagher, and they do this experiment on him and they don't even put him into a room with 10 degrees centigrade, and they work out. And by the way,
10 degrees.
10 degrees centigrade, 10 degrees centigrade, which I don't know what you Americans have to change that now to work out what that is for you, but it's like in the 50s or the 40s. It's not freezing, not even close to freezing, right? It's in fact 10 degrees above freezing centigrade. He's put in this room and they do certain experiments on him and how does he feel and all that. And of course, he's a very healthy man. But basically, and we could have said this, and a lot of wise and ordinary people know this, that being cold is not good for you. And in fact, being cold is much worse than being warm. And, isn't it interesting? We have global warming, but nobody mentions the fact that actually it's better to be warm than to be cold. And just a couple of pieces from this idiotic piece in the BBC. 10 degrees is the average temperature that people will be living in if they can't afford to heat their homes, says the professor involved in the experiment. The evidence, and again, just a big, long, massive article, the evidence clearly suggests that cold is more deadly than the heat. There are a higher number of deaths caused through cold snaps than there are through the heat snaps. Who among us didn't know this, by the way? But the BBC have just discovered it and they're making a whole story about it. So I do think that more recognition needs to be paid for the dangers associated with cold. And here's what more recognition, here's the question that the BBC aren't asking. Why are people in a very rich country like the UK going to... why would there be ever a situation where they would experience cold? And, BBC, maybe you should ask yourselves, with their climate division in the BBC,
yes,
maybe they should ask themselves about their own guilt in allowing this situation to be even a possibility. And they go on to say that cold favours viruses, that viruses do well in the cold as well. And then what can you actually do about it? And it's unbelievable. They give tips here about what kind of clothing you should wear. I mean, and wear gloves in the house and warm socks.
BBC, you're not granny, right? We've got grandmothers to tell us how to not feel cold.
Switch your
BBC,
foods.
you're supposed to be gathering data and gathering news and fighting misinformation. So fight the misinformation, the fake information about fracking. How about that?
Switch foods. Here we go. Just on the suggestions they're making. Switch foods to a higher carbohydrate diet. And I love this one.
And then lecture us about obesity.
And then, would you hear though? And then generate more body heat by moving around and not just sitting in a chair and watching TV.
Go screw yourself.
Now, I was funny that you would say that, because I was going to, but I'm not going to do it. But there's two words that come to mind when I read the BBC saying, get up and don't sit in a chair watching TV. How dare you, by the way?
Yeah.
I'll go for that one, right, Philip? You know what I was going to say.
Yes,
but I wouldn't say it because
the last word was off.
Correct, and the last word is off. Buzz off, by the way. There you go. Look at me doing that. Yeah. By the way, how dare you? How dare you speak to people who have worked all day and come home and want to sit on their chair and be comfortable and watch their TV? And their TV, by the way, that they pay for TV license to the BBC for, for God's sake. Yeah. Anyway, that as if that wasn't enough. The other story I just briefly want to bring people is, basically environmentalists have all the worst ideas. They're unbelievable. So in the midst of this global energy crisis that everyone is aware of right now, in the midst of that, guess what the good old USA is going to do? Guess what the good old USA is going to do in the midst of a global energy crisis? They're going to spend $500 million getting rid of hydroelectric plants. 4 hydroelectric plants in California. 4 dams. It'll be the largest dam removal in the world when it goes forward. The largest in the world.
Project.
And what I think is interesting, look at this chart I just want to put up. And we're coming to the very end of the show. I just want to mention this. Look at this chart I'm just putting up right now. This is California's energy mix for 2020. So of that energy mix, 13.6% was hydroelectric. Is hydroelectric. And in one of the articles I read, and I don't have the piece here in front of me. In one of the articles, they actually said that in order to proceed, in order for California to keep going, people, with this, so the 13% is going to go away. The hydroelectric is going to go away. In order for for California to keep going, they're going to ask people to conserve, to use less energy. There is an energy crisis, and you know what we're going to do? We're going to take away some of the energy mix. And one of the things I often say to students when I speak about these issues is it's very interesting how the environmental movement loves renewables. So they love the renewables. And I always say, and I did this just recently up in Santa Barbara with the Young Americas Foundation students, and I asked them the question, of all the renewables out there, what are the 2 that are most reliable? Of all the renewables, there's 2 of them that are actually really reliable, that are really, you can really count on. And it's really funny. My husband mightn't know what the 2 are. It's funny. Well, one of them is hydroelectric. It's very, very reliable, can be really well relied on. Now, obviously, drought comes into that picture in California. But that's not the reason they're getting rid of that's not the reason they're getting rid of the dams. They're getting rid of the dams because you want to have the salmon roam free. Yes. And other nonsense where that nonsense came from.
You'd miss them at Costco.
But there's 2 reasons. The 2 most reliable energy sources, renewable energy sources, are hydroelectric and wood. And both of those 2 most reliable sources of renewable energy are the 2 sources of energy that environmentalists don't like. And I always make the point about wood. You see, wood is actually a renewable resource. Most environmentalists don't know the big, amazing truth that trees grow. And it's a huge revelation, which I'm very happy to tell them about if I can keep my if I can kind of keep from going completely nuts. I used to have that problem. Do you remember that film when I'd see these Greenpeace people looking for signatures in Santa Monica with their big, big healthy.
I think they stopped gathering signatures.
I think they've stopped it.
They found Santa Monica was no longer a safe space because of a crazy Irish woman.
I think that might be
ranting and
true.
raving at them.
Anyway,
the poor
unfortunate
children.
soy boy. We've come to the end of the show.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Have a great Thanksgiving.
Have a great Thanksgiving, and do remember, if you can, we have this matching donation that we really need to match at $50,000, and you can go to unreportedstorysociety.com and give what you can. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye bye.